Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Very excited today to have a distinguished panel here of genuine experts on the Horn of Africa. We're going to be talking about regional actors, so with a lot of focus on the GCC countries, of course. I'm sure we'll hit on Turkey and a few others as well. Um, Hudson is doing this series of panels in collaboration with the Israel-Africa Institute, and our previous one was on global actors and what they're up to in the Horn and the effect on the Horn. So as I said already, we'll be focused on regional actors today. So very brief introductions here. You can find our panelists' CVs online if you want a deeper dive, but Asher Lubatsky is a research fellow at the Israel-Africa Institute. He's also affiliated with the University of Houston. Then we have Alan Boswell. He is the Horn of Africa director at the International Crisis Group. And then we have Rashid Abdi, the director of research at Sahan Research, a Nairobi-based research organization. Thank you, gentlemen, to all of you for taking your time. We're going to move quickly. There's a ton to cover, and so we'll inevitably miss some things. But I also think we have a chance to have a really interesting discussion here. So maybe I'll start. Maybe Rashid, let's start with you. Actually, can you give us a, a as much as you can in a short amount of time, a sort of a broad description of regional actors' activity in the Horn of Africa? So let's focus on UAE, Saudi, and Turkey maybe within that group. And I think we'll have to talk about Qatar as well at some point. But if you could just give us in broad strokes, what are those three actors doing in the Horn right now?
Thank you very much, Joshua, and hello to the colleagues who are on the panel. If you look at the map of the Horn of Africa, you will actually quickly realize that it is an important strategic region. It overlooks a major waterway, the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea. It also is it's where the Suez Canal is located as well. So it is linked to a major geopolitical maritime route, maritime corridor. And the history of competition is as old as the Suez Canal, actually, from the 16th century. I think what we have seen in recent years is, of course, this region also become much more contested. The number of middle powers, emerging powers in the Gulf who are vying for markets, who are vying for commercial advantage, who are vying for military dominance have increased. And we have seen that increase actually at some point reach dangerous levels, especially during the war in Yemen, when the Red Sea became heavily militarized. Countries in the region were drawn into the war in Yemen, Eritrea, to some extent, Sudan. We saw countries actually in the region become sucked into the conflicts in the Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula. But in many ways, these are not, these are not two regions. These are essentially one region from a geopolitical perspective. The conflict systems in the Gulf, but also in the Horn of Africa, interlock and intersect all the time. So it's not a surprise that in recent years we have seen a more assertive Gulf drive policies, and also in some senses also inflame conflicts and aggravate competition. I think the biggest actors, of course, remains the Gulf wealthy Arab states, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, a non-Arab state which can be classified as a middle power, but it's not essentially a Gulf state, is Turkey. Turkey is a Euro-Asian power, and increasingly also talking of itself as an Afro-Asian power as well. It occupies a very important, space in Europe. It's at the heart of Europe, but also straddles major, geopolitical theater, linking Europe to the Caucasus and also to the Gulf. So each of these new actors have brought with them, different styles of conducting foreign policy, different, approaches. What they all have in common is actually, first, I will think, a very externalized sense of security. In order to protect the homeland, many of these countries need to assert or to project military power or build military alliances beyond the homeland. And so these externalized, idea of security cuts across all the regional states. Turkey, for many decades, has pursued, a very aggressive military posture towards the neighborhood, and sees itself as a regional power and sees external actors who want to build influence in, say, Syria as a major direct strategic threat to them. So the same thing also with other Gulf states. The Yemen war was actually triggered by this sense, again, of the UAE and Saudi Arabia to manage Yemen. So the Horn of Africa is now seen as an extension of that concentric circle of sphere of security by the Gulf actors. Of course, it is an unequal contest. Some countries are small in military size and cannot bring much to the military competition. Turkey is probably stands out clearly over the others because it is a significant scientific and military power. It has, under Erdogan, I think, pursued a very aggressive, assertive foreign policy, which is militarized. We saw that actually quickly lead to tensions in the Mediterranean. Turkey has serious, security problems with Greece, Cyprus, France, Italy. Its competition, it's also assertive policies in the Mediterranean, especially oil and gas exploration, has also inflamed tensions. I think what we see is Turkey export that model of geopolitical muscle flexing to the Red Sea. Last year, Turkey, of course, cut a deal with the Somali government, which allowed Turkey to, for the first time, actually deploy its naval assets in the Red Sea, but also in the Western Indian Ocean, to protect Somali coastal territorial waters. But I think we also saw how quickly Turkey also exploited that military deal to actually project itself as a potentially to have a lucrative deal with Somalia on oil and gas, offshore oil and gas. A major research ship by Turkey, which does heavy, exploration work, especially in the Mediterranean, is right now in the Indian Ocean, where it's conducting surveys. I think it's almost now complete. There hasn't been any word about the outcome of this research and survey, but clearly, I think everyone is working on the assumption that there is some economically viable prospects for oil and gas offshore. I think the other model is, of course, the UAE model, which mixes, I think, an externalized military also projection of power, but also increasingly mimicking China and building its own style of infrastructure, acquisition of ports, but also linking these ports in a kind of what one might call ports and belt strategy. We have seen how the UAE has now emerged as the single most dominant economic player in the east coast of Africa. From Berbera down to Maputo, the UAE has bought stakes in regional ports or has acquired it. Berbera stands out because it's its largest, the UAE acquisition, and the UAE sunk roughly around over 400 million US dollars to build that port to international standards. And in many ways, it is an impressive investment, never done by a single actor in Africa in recent years. So it's definitely a massive investment and just shows to you the level of UAE's projection of economic clout. Also, the UAE is significantly buying into hinterland economies. And I think that makes sense because, the DP strategy is not just to acquire, infrastructure ports, but also to link these ports or to hook these ports to hinterland economies which are viable. And I think Berbera, in many ways, was designed for Ethiopia. For a variety of reasons, Ethiopia hasn't used it, but it definitely has. If just one more point before I throw it back to you, Qatar is an important actor as well. It is a smaller country, lacks probably the resources and the military might of the other players. What Qatar has leveraged, of course, is its geography and also a long history of peace diplomacy, conflict resolution. It sees itself as the go-to broker, especially cutting deals with militant Islamist movement. And that has given Qatar probably increasingly important clout. It is even countries which in general will object to Qatar's foreign policy finds it to some extent palatable to deal with Qatar as a mediator. Of course, views of Qatar are different. There are some who sees as a ruthless player, pragmatist, but also see them as an interested party. Especially if you look at the Turkey's role, the UAE's role, the Qatari role in Afghanistan, but also potentially Qatar's intent to pursue a peace deal between Al-Shabaab and the Somali government. So those are I think this is a broad brush kind of analysis, just to give you the context and also some of the emerging big players.
Yeah, thanks, Rashid. Really useful to, as you say, establish the context there. I think your point about projecting power, these small states projecting power, is key. To me, that's one of the primary explanations for why the Emiratis are as aggressive as they are. When you're a small state, when you lack strategic depth, one of the mechanisms is to, as you say, project that power beyond your borders. The Qataris, to your point about their mediation strategy, that's a different way of power projection in a sense, right? Because they're trying to make themselves indispensable to the mediation efforts on high stakes geopolitical issues, and therefore that's a way of protecting themselves. We saw them just in the last couple of days. They're mediating between the Rwandans and the Congolese, so they're back in that mediating role. They've been involved in mediation efforts in Sudan, between Djibouti and Eritrea, etc. So, yeah, Qatar, a really interesting player. Alan, so something we've seen recently in Somalia is Al-Shabaab making some very serious gains. This brings up Turkey because Rashid already referenced how involved Turkey is in Somalia. It has the lucrative port deals for the seaport, the airport as well. It has its military base there. The largest embassy in the world is in Mogadishu. The largest Turkish embassy in the world is in Mogadishu. So they're all in on Mogadishu. So I've been trying to think through, how does Turkey respond? We've seen them send some new drones, etc. Um, what are they willing to do you think, if Shabab keeps pushing forward? Is this going to become a Libya style intervention for Turkey because they just have to protect Mogadishu? Or do you think maybe there's some other calculations here that they might make? Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to speculate on what the Turks might do if Al-Shabaab essentially marches into Mogadishu. I mean, in some ways, Al-Shabaab sort of always, in some ways, been on the outskirts of Mogadishu. But if we start to see something more drastic. I mean, I think one of the interesting things, for instance, about the Turkish involvement militarily right now in Somalia is and speaks to not only that all these middle powers have their own interest and have their own methods, but then also the alliances between them are always sort of shifting as well. Is that right now you have both the Turks and the Emiratis conducting airstrikes coordinated by the federal government on Al-Shabaab, and this has been going on for a while. And of course, the Turks and Emiratis were not always on good terms, and it doesn't sound like to me that they're necessarily coordinating uh, directly on Somalia in terms of this. It might be the federal government doing it, but I do think it's interesting that we're constantly sort of seeing, in some ways, the middle powers' interests and their methods have some durability and there's some continuity related to that. The main shifts in the region have been basically their competition vis-a-vis each other. So, I mean, you raise a good point about the Turks and their level of investment in Somalia. A question we've been trying to ask within Crisis Group is if we start to see a broader Western pullout of support for this federal government, what might be the reaction from some of these others, such as the Emiratis or the Turks, or the Qataris, who have all in various ways invested in the Somali political system. There's been criticisms that they've, in some ways, been free riders off of the broader sort of Western state building support that's been there for the federal government, although that's not the way they would see it. So I think it's a fair question. If there's a lot of hypotheticals here, but if we do see the Trump administration in some ways signal a um, a major pivot and a pullout in sense for support to the federal government. Does that mean the Europeans and others start to question their investment? And then what do these other middle powers do strategically? So I don't have an answer, sorry, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, no, thanks. Your point about the shifting alliances is very well made because even in the last 5 years, it's extraordinary to see how the alignments have shifted because traditionally we thought about, well, you've got the Egyptians and the Emiratis and the Saudis were all sort of working in concert on issues like Libya, Yemen. But now suddenly we're in a new era here where the Saudis and the Emiratis are more and more at loggerheads. The Egyptians are also diverging in some ways from the Emirati line. So it's a really dynamic space, and that's part of what makes it so hard to to figure out what's going on and to prognosticate, but also what keeps it interesting, I'd say. Asher, um, I just referenced the Saudis. We haven't talked about them too much here, but we do need to since they are significant players in the Horn. So obviously they're involved in trying to mediate the Sudan conflict through the Jeddah process in concert with the United States. Not much not much success there. But give us a sense, what are the Saudis after in the Horn of Africa, and how do they engage? How are they different from how the Emiratis are approaching this, which we've already talked about, and how the Turks are approaching this?
Right, yeah. Thank you for this question. And you're totally right that about 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we could really draw nice, neatly those alliances. And now the Middle East worked with Africa, at least Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa, according to those alliances. We knew there was what we call the Saudi Emirati kind of alliance that had Egypt in it and had most of the other Gulf states, not Qatar, but most of the others, and they were kind of together, and they were all fighting together in Yemen, right, for a few years. So it was that's almost the most that the alliance can get, right, into a coalition that actually fighting together against a common enemy, which was Iran and its proxies, right, and allies. They brought Sudan into this camp. back during Bashir time. They brought Eritrea even and Djibouti and Somalia, and they worked so well together. At least it looked like that, right? It seemed like that they're working really closely together. And in the last few years, and I would say probably the war in Yemen, instead of uniting them further, at some point, kind of because the success was not achieved, kind of broke this coalition. And of course, other things that happen in the world, changes the coup in Sudan, although it's not directly first affected it, but later the civil war in Sudan and even COVID and post-COVID effects really made it the war in Ukraine, even and all those kind of geopolitical changes made this coalition not being as tightly close to each other. It's not that the strategic goals are much different. Still, the Emirates and the Saudis see Iran, right, and Iran's proxies and the Houthis in Yemen as their main rival. They still see the Horn of Africa as an important region, and Sudan is an important region to confront Iran and its proxies, and to get other goals like economy benefits, agricultural investments, and so on. They still see global, Sunni, Salafist, jihadist groups also as a threat. But the tactics between the Saudis and the Emirates really, as you also implied, really changed and they diverged. And you see that the Emirates are going on a much more aggressive route from supporting the RSF in Sudan and supporting Ethiopia in the war in Tigray in much more aggressive ways than the Saudis did, and supporting Somaliland in a much more. The Saudis are not there at all. The Saudis officially support the federal government in Somalia. So you do see that they really diverge. The Saudis are going on a more, I would say, a bit more conservative tactics here. Of soft power influence, of investments, of working with more, I would say, in these traditional allies in a way that governments that are officially recognized, for example, Sudan, the SAF, right, and the Somalia and Somalis in Mogadishu, right? Those are the countries that are internationally recognized. And so the Saudis go according to those lines of working with those former allies or current allies that are Arab states that are members of the Arab League, right? And they are internationally recognized, while the Emirates are going in a more less, I don't know if normative is the way, but in a more aggressive, more maybe adventurous way, and supporting non-state actors in a way too. You see, in Somaliland is practically a state, but not an internationally recognized one, and in Sudan as well. And so we see this, the tactics are different. The tactics are different. And because the tactics are different, it sometimes put the Saudis and the Emirates in a clash. Because if you support one side, as the Saudis, for example, support the Mogadishu, and the Emirates tend to support the Somaliland more, it's in the end, it's clashing. So you see this kind of like, it's still they're like-minded, but because the tactics are different, they see moments of contention and clashing between themselves. So yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Asher. That's a really interesting point about the fact that ideologically they're still pretty aligned. Like there hasn't been that sort of core shift. But because the tactics are really different, I thought your point about the Emiratis' willingness to support non-traditional, non-state actors like the RSF, most notoriously in Sudan, but also Somaliland, was a good one. So want to switch a little bit to something that's been raising some alarms in Washington and I know elsewhere, and that's the prospect of an Ethiopia-Eritrea war. There's been a lot of concerning developments. We don't nearly have enough time to get into why this might happen, but suffice it to say, a lot of analysts that I respect and who live in the region, including some people on this panel, have publicly stated their alarm, and I've also had plenty of private conversations as well with various people. So if this happens, again, God forbid, but if it does indeed happen, one of the problems here is that it will, in my estimation, but disagree with me if you think you're wrong, it'll absolutely become a proxy conflict almost immediately, and maybe even get folded into the Sudan conflict here. Rashid, can you walk us through what that might look like? And again, we're all speculating here, so with all the due caveats about speculation, but if there is an Ethiopia-Eritrea war, how do you see regional actors getting involved on either side? And maybe previous to you answering that question, are we seeing any pressure from regional powers on Ethiopia or Eritrea to not take this route?
Thank you very much, Joshua, for raising that question. There is very little doubt in my mind, and at least in the minds of my colleagues, that the prospects of a new war between Ethiopia and Eritrea is now much higher than at any time. We know for a long time, at least since the Tigray war ended, that the two allies, former allies, who actually made a tactical alliance to actually defeat Tigray, were increasingly not seeing eye to eye on many things. Eritrea felt itself, let down by the fact that Abiy did not finish the job. Tigrayan, Ethiopian, Eritrean military did not leave parts of Tigray as was stipulated in the Pretoria Accord. Eritrean military forces were stationed in parts of Western Tigray, arming and equipping and training Fano militia, and also helping the Amhara to maintain control in Western Tigray. The Eritrean government also continued deepening its relations with Afar rebels in Ethiopia, with whom it has had a long history of cooperation. So the potential for a new conflict was there. Ethiopia, could not take on Eritrea for a variety of reasons. Firstly, the army was decimated by the conflict in Tigray. The bulk of the fighting machinery of the ENDF was basically gone. To some extent, that was the case also with Eritrea. But Eritrea has a much more disciplined military. It is a much more disciplined military state. It is small, has always faced the threat of smallness and being beleaguered. And so it doesn't rely on regular army. It relies on a reserve army. And the national service. So pretty much every Eritrean can actually fight in terms of crisis and war. That was a big help for Eritrea, a regimented society, and also kept the regime in power. Now, in the last 1 year, there has been a steady rearming by both states. Ethiopia has rebuilt some of its capacity, has acquired, fresh, at least combat jets or new combat jets has bought at a very extraordinary amount of money, while most of them are not new, especially the SUs, which were bought recently from India. But clearly, you can see Ethiopia really investing in technology and investing in air power. The other, I think, important way in which Abiy has rebuilt his capacities, of course, to acquire the Akinci, drones from Turkey. He's also just commissioned a bullet factory. So Ethiopia will be basically making its own bullets for a variety of weapons, but largely AK-47s. Then we also see Ethiopia also very swiftly reverse engineering many of the technologies it has received. So there is already an indigenous industry underway. Now, in recent days, there has been a lot of reports about Eritrea deploying extra troops on the border, but clearly Eritrea has also been very busy. It has acquired new help and hardware from Egypt. And so the stakes are very high. The two armies are heavily armed. The reasons to go to war are very clear. Eritrea will not be content to see Tigray regroup or Ethiopia, become a stronger state again. The same thing with Abiy. Abiy desperately believes in the idea that Ethiopia should regain at least the port of Assab. That was the original goal, and not even Somaliland. And that, I think, is an important issue to remember. However, the momentum towards war is very high. The external actors who also could gain from a war are increasingly there. Egypt and the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia is very much broken. Egypt has lost the strategic competition over the Nile. It is no longer part of the comprehensive framework treaty, which brings together a number of states. Egypt is also increasingly feeling isolated, but also feels that it needs to punish Ethiopia. And its two ways of doing that is to exploit the tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia, but also to exploit Eritrea's tensions with Ethiopia as well. So the likelihood of actually Egypt directly becoming involved in the war is very high. Egyptian Navy is now muscle flexing in the Red Sea. Egypt is now a significant military power. It does not have the expeditionary capabilities of, say, Israel or other regional actors, even like Turkey. It has a few submarines. The kind of air capabilities it has to project expeditionary capabilities are very minimal. It has only helicopter carriers and not aircraft carriers. It could probably stage cruise missile attacks from bases in Eritrea, conduct raids from Eritrea, and use as a refueling stop for its long-range bombers. So those are, I think, real scenarios that if Egypt has a proxy state very close to Ethiopia, Ethiopia is in big trouble. Egypt, of course, is a cautious power as well. It makes a lot of aggressive noises, but probably, will pursue a much more, I think, sedate policy and not become directly sucked into a major conflict. There is also prospect, of course, of Egypt becoming sucked into the war in Somalia. Egypt plans to deploy about 1,000 special forces in actually the heartland of Al-Shabaab. So Ethiopia, which initially wanted to also control that region, now feels slightly unsure. the room for competition for cooperation between Ethiopia and Egypt in Somalia is minimal, is almost zero. If you have a war in northern Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, you may as well have a war in the south if Egypt has troops in Somalia. You will have a multiple flank war in which war is being waged on multiple fronts, and then actors come in. We have also seen, Egypt try to expand that alliance to include Turkey, but Turkey again is a pragmatic player, much more cautious. It does not want to get drawn, has major stakes, trade stakes in Ethiopia, doesn't want to become, involved in the war. Increasingly gravitating towards, brokerage diplomacy and peace diplomacy. But I agree with you, Joshua, that if a war breaks out between Eritrea, it will be devastating. It will suck in regional actors. But another important point, a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea will have to be fought again in a terrain which actually just emerged out of conflict, and that is Tigray. Tigray geography, you cannot wage an effective war against Eritrea unless you go through, Tigray. And that is why Abiy has been putting a lot of pressure on the Tigrayans to come on his side. Tigrayans do not feel they have a stake in a war. They definitely feel resentful towards Eritrea. They don't trust Abiy. So that complicates the picture for Abiy's grand plan of retaking Assab. That complicates it. I don't foresee a situation in which Tigray will make common cause with Eritrea against Ethiopia, because the trauma of war and the bitterness is so deep. But still, the potential of also the power contest in Tigray becoming inflamed by a new war is also high. So I think from a perspective of a peacemaker in Washington or a diplomat, you now have a perfect storm, a scenario in which major big powers will become, first of all, two heavily armed states, an interstate war, and not a localized dispute, not one state taking advantage of an internal conflict, but two conventional wars, which will be devastating. If you look at the pattern of warfare, especially between Eritrea and Ethiopia, it is bloody. The two countries have a very high threshold of casualties, so it is going to be bloody.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I totally endorse your assessment here, especially of how devastating this war could be. An interesting phenomenon, because you referenced the very high threshold for casualties. These are Christian Orthodox, right? Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox countries, but they still refer to their battle casualties as martyrs, which is sort of an interesting phenomenon that you don't see in many other places in like a Christian context. So that I don't know how meaningful that is, but I've always been struck by that because it is a little bit unique. Yeah, and the point about Ethiopia potentially facing a two-front war is really interesting. If Egypt does indeed have troops in Somalia at the time, and maybe Somalia gets involved as well. I don't know how, when they can't effectively fight Al-Shabaab, I don't know how they think they could fight, a conventional war, but who knows?
Yeah. If I can make one quick point, because I almost forgot, and you actually said that are there any regional efforts to try to stabilize, to actually preempt a war? I think things are now even much more difficult. You have a new African Union chairman who comes from Djibouti. Djibouti has had a long history of tensions with, and actually a state of war with Eritrea. They fought over a small island in the Red Sea called Dumeira. Djibouti took Eritrea to the UN Security Council. The cases and the issues are still there, simmering. The man who actually, was a foreign minister throughout that period is now the AU chair. And Eritrea if it was possible for the AU to have any leverage, it will now have zero leverage because the AU chair is actually Eritrea. And so you have, I think, a much more difficult environment of actually Africa really preempting a war. Then, of course, you have a subsidiary organization under the AU, which is IGAD. IGAD is led by an Ethiopian. And I think IGAD is unlikely to be an instrument of preemptive conflict diplomacy because, again, its executive director is Ethiopian. Eritrea has always wanted, has always called IGAD an irrelevant organization. Eritrea is an isolationist state, suspicious of multilateralism. And I think now they even have a more probably valid reasons why they cannot agree to any multilateral third party, internationally led, I think, conflict peace diplomacy. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. No, a good extra point there. Alan, on this Ethiopia-Eritrea issue, where would the Emiratis fit in here? If at all, right? I think they would, but they have an interesting history here. They had a base in Assab, Eritrea. So they had obviously a quite deep relationship at some point with the Eritreans. That relationship has frayed by all accounts. They have massive investments in Ethiopia. And the Emiratis are really influential, important actors here in the whole region. So what's the Emirati role?
Yeah, good question. I was also enjoying listening to Rashid is a living encyclopedia on the Horn of Africa. So I love sitting on panels with him, so I can just sit back and listen. So I want to add something to something that Asher said, which is Asher said, that part of what we're seeing in terms of competition is just a difference in tactics. There is definitely a difference of tactics and methods. And maybe that explains some of the difference that we see in Somalia. But there has been quite a bit of more active competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially over the Red Sea arena. And that's a spot where it's not just a difference in tactics. We've seen a real difference in interests. And I think it's very interesting, as you pointed out, that the UAE used to have spots on the Red Sea, both in Eritrea and Djibouti, and they essentially they got essentially booted out of both of those, or at least are no longer there. There has been a major interest of powers now, of countries that are on the Red Sea, to essentially try and prevent others from coming to the Red Sea. And you've seen Saudi Arabia and Egypt, although they have their own competition over this file to a degree, but have both worked together to try to form this Red Sea Council, which is basically a collection of states, but only states that actually have a coastline on the Red Sea. It hasn't actually come together, but when you go to Riyadh and you talk to them about the Horn of Africa and you ask what your Horn of Africa strategy is, they actually start talking about the Red Sea Council. And you will see that whereas the UAE is investing in the hinterlands, Saudi Arabia has made its major investments in the Horn of Africa region primarily with countries that are actually on the coast and you've seen on Sudan, of course, that the Sunnis Armed Forces is the state institution, at least the one most left standing. It's also the one that is on the Red Sea, right? Whereas the RSF is further west. So you've seen a pattern whereby Saudi Arabia is investing heavily in the countries essentially in its very near periphery, basically whom they consider as neighbors on the Red Sea coast, and competing less once you get into the hinterlands. The major risk we have, I think, with an Ethiopia-Eritrea war, I mean, I shouldn't say the major risk because obviously it would be devastating on its own. But you essentially have the same countries who are backing SAF in its war with RSF in Sudan. The same overlap is there with Ethiopia and Eritrea, meaning SAF looks heavily to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as well as others, including Qatar for support, whereas the RSF looks to the UAE. Likewise, in Eritrea, on the Eritrea-Ethiopia divide, you have Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who are largely supportive and have strong ties to Eritrea, and you have UAE as the closest external ally, essentially to Ethiopia. You also have Ethiopia, which is leaned towards the RSF in the Sudan war, and Eritrea, which has been supporting militias on behalf of the Sunnis armed forces in Sudan. So you see that one of the major concerns is that you have a regional polarization on these issues that start to overlap, and that's when you can have really big. That's when you can have really big conflagrations sort of break out, because when it all overlaps on the exact same fault line, then you can have you could have a war where the boundaries between the different wars becomes hard to fully delineate. I'll say on in terms of the UAE specifically when it comes to Red Sea, there's a lot of questions about how interested, how much they engage Addis Ababa on this question of Abiy's stated interest in getting a Red Sea port. What I will say is that when you go to regional actors around, Egypt, Riyadh, within Africa itself, there is clearly a suspicion that there's a suspicion they have that if Ethiopia got a Red Sea port, that it would essentially be a path towards the UAE also getting one. And those perceptions and suspicions in this context start to matter, not as much as reality, but are also a significant factor. So in the context of a geopolitical environment which is changing, in which we've seen these middle actors, the UAE especially, I think, figured out about a decade ago and started moving, that this was a time for world building, so to speak. This was a moment that favored actors who moved, first mover actors could essentially help create facts on the ground, moving ahead. And so you both have actions, but then you have counter reactions. And definitely the perception is that essentially the UAE is on the side with Ethiopia, and both of them have been very keen to get Red Sea ports. That's something that, and like you said, UAE used to have one. Ethiopia, if you go back historically, used to have one, and they essentially feel like they've lost those. And that's a perception of others in the region, and they're starting. Some of those people who don't want to see that happen are backing Eritrea. You can see the dynamics here for basically major competition over the Red Sea, but also a lot of suspicion, action, counter reaction, that risks escalating the situation, and it overlaps pretty significantly with what we're seeing in Sudan. And Rashid mentioned, how it overlaps on Somalia to a degree as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. And very quickly, a follow-up question for you. Why are the Saudis aligned in some way with the Eritreans on this? Because Eritrea is, famously sort of a prickly actor, let's say, and difficult to work with, and as the Eritreans discovered. So why are the Saudis going with the Eritreans here?
Well, they're neighbors. The Saudis are a conservative, they've been described as a conservative. They're conservative. They also view themselves as the regional hegemon. But they're very comfortable with sort of state on state interactions that are very protocol heavy. And because they're more conservative, they might ask less, I would say, maybe in transactional terms, especially on this side of the Red Sea, than others in the GCC, such as the UAE and Qatar have done. So I think they've invested in it heavily, frankly, partly to out of an interest to keep the UAE away from the Red Sea. I think I don't think they would state that directly, but I think that's obviously a component here. But they want to maintain, for security purposes, I think they contain that western side of the Red Sea. They've invested heavily in relationships on that western side of the Red Sea. And President Isaias of Eritrea, he speaks very fluent Arabic, by the way. He's had more explosive relationships with other Gulf capitals, where I think they go in and they think they're like essentially buying a client when they invest in Eritrea. And Isaias is not a very Isaias does what he thinks is best for himself or / Eritrea, which I think in his mind are are fairly tied together. And so you've had explosive relationships where others have invested in Eritrea and then been really disappointed that essentially they haven't gotten they haven't gotten a client relationship, right? I don't think Saudis have invested in Eritrea in the same way in a client relationship. I think they've invested in it in a slightly more conservative way, and that's prevented there being perhaps a big blow up. Maybe that could come at some point in the future, but uh, yeah, I don't know. That's a sort of rambling series of answers about it, but it is strategic. There is a strategic play here, that where the Saudis and Eritreans do see some convergence in interest.
Yeah, no, thank you. That
Yeah,
was super
I'll
helpful.
throw in a few comments. Alan is absolutely right. Afewerki is probably the most fluent speaker of classical Arabic in the Horn of Africa than any of the regional leaders. Not even Somalis who are Muslims can speak the level of Arabic which Afewerki speaks. This goes back to history when the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Front, which waged a long insurgency against the Darg, was actually bankrolled by the Arab states. And the biggest backer of the Eritrean liberation struggle was actually the Saudis. And so many of the early cadres, of course, of the leadership were also Muslims as well. And Arabic was a standard language in Eritrea before actually any other language. It was seen as unifying the guerrilla campaign itself. So Arabic was essentially the language of liberation, so to speak, in Eritrea. There wasn't a controversy. People were not conflicted about it. And so here, irony is, of course, a Christian leader, an Orthodox, speaking perfect classical Arabic. Of course, the Eritreans are also Semitic, so that may also be partly the reason why Arabic has become accepted as the official language in Eritrea, but also the ability to speak perfect Arabic has, of course, opened doors for Afewerki in the Gulf, but keeps him trusted. Even when they disagree with him, they see him as part of Oruba or Arabness. Eritrea is a member of the Arab has observer status with the Arab League, and also takes part in many other meetings of the Arab world. Is welcomed, gets access. I suspect that the Saudis probably are the heaviest budgetary supporters of Eritrea than any other state. I don't know. I've had figures like 100 million per year. Of course, that is a huge amount for a state like Eritrea, which also has lucrative minerals as well. So there are a variety of reasons why, of all the actors in the Gulf, Afewerki will probably listen to the Saudis. And so if you are looking at a prospect for peace diplomacy, you should be talking to the Saudis. Back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. I love these panels because I always learn interesting things. Yeah, clearly any sort of initiative, any sort of peace overtures is going to have to involve the Saudis, probably the Emiratis, et cetera, because this is just the reality of the Horn these days. This is why we're doing this series. These regional actors are massively influential, and have been for quite a while now. Asher, so Ethiopia, this is an interesting issue for Israel, actually. Long historic links to Ethiopia, including, famously airlifting Ethiopian Jews out of Ethiopia who now live in Israel. So a lot of historic links. There's also been rumors over the years of Israeli engagements with Eritrea as well. Rumors, I've never seen anything really solid on it, but tell us, what is Israel's perspective here? And then I want to link that to another hot button issue, and that's the Houthis, who are right across the Gulf of Aden from the area we're talking about here. President Trump, just a few days ago, had some very explicit things to say about the Houthis and Iran specifically. In Ethiopia-Eritrea conflicts, could that involve the Houthi issue in some way? So yeah, maybe I'm trying to make too tangential of a link here, but walk us through that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that first, as you mentioned, for Israel, the main issue, the main interest in this region are the Houthis. Okay, it's the national security interest. The Houthis, as we know, have redeclared war again about 2 weeks ago, saying explicitly that they're gonna block all Israeli shipping through the Red Sea, right? And since yesterday or 2 days ago, started launching again missiles directly to Israel. The last one was last night. So for Israel, the Houthis are a big issue. That's also an issue that is not only big, it's also in a way unsolvable, at least for now. While Israel had plans against Hezbollah, had plans with Syria, had plans with Gaza, with the Houthis, Israel, it can strike from time to time, but it doesn't seem like it makes any effect on the Houthis. So that just makes Israel even more interested in alliances and some presence even perhaps in this region, right? You need to somehow get closer to the Houthis in order to tackle them, because just like sending your airplanes there, air jets, it doesn't work with the Houthis. As you see, it's a very questionable even that if the all-American military can do anything. And as we saw, the old Saudi Emirati coalition didn't really get anything. So this is an Israel problem. It's obviously a regional problem and an international problem that is right now not so solvable. So Israel is interested in the region mostly because of that now. And so as you said also, as you mentioned, Israel and Ethiopia have very long relations. They are still pretty good. It went up, there were ups and downs, but they're still pretty good. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, the Ethiopian foreign minister visited Israel, was one of the first African leaders. There were few before, but only very few that visited Israel since the war in Gaza started. So that was a thing. Israel has a relatively new foreign minister itself, who is very keen to developing relations with African states, especially in the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa. So Israel wants to have this strategically, and the main goal here is tackling the Houthis and having alliances in this region. So Ethiopia is the main. Ethiopia, to some extent Kenya, but Kenya is not so relevant to Eritrea and Ethiopia. But Kenya and Ethiopia are the main pillars for countries that Israel actually can work with. And in a scenario, because our question here is after we discuss the scenario of a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, right? So in a scenario of such a war, I see, as Rashid mentioned before, I see in terms of regional alliances, I see Egypt as very committed to Eritrea. I think for all the rest of the regional actors, it will be a dilemma. I think the next one to commit, if at all, to anyone are the Emirates, to Ethiopia. That's what I agree. I think all the rest, the Saudis, they may have some preferences, but they will have to think really hard about this, because it's just to pick Eritrea against Ethiopia. Clearly, it's also a big decision to make, and it's not such clear. Rashid talked about Turkey. Now it will be very hard for them also to choose. So I totally agree with it. But in terms of Israel, so if Israel, could, they would have relations with Eritrea. Okay, as you said, there were relations with Eritrea. A rumor said also military relations. We're not really sure about this, but there were diplomatic relations for many years. Officially, there's still an Israeli embassy in Eritrea. So there are those relations. So Israel has nothing against Eritrea per se, okay? But Israel does want those alliances. And I can see a scenario in which Ethiopia, which may be more isolated because of such a war, right? There maybe Saudi help and Turkish help will not come as easily as it came during the Tigray war, right? Ethiopia will be more isolated. They'll need more support. So they'll have probably the Emirates, but they'll need more, right? probably. And Israel can be a player. And it won't be an ideological issue, anti-Eritrean, right? It just will be an interest to get alliances in the region and to get alliances that are sustainable. And Ethiopia is obviously a very important actor there. We're talking the Emirates, the fact that the Emirates will probably, right, will help the Ethiopians will also help Israel because Emirates are de facto Israeli allies. If Somaliland will get, we didn't mention that, but if Somaliland will somehow get into this conflict as well, that might be also an issue that may actually push for more Israeli involvement because Israel would love to have relations with Somaliland. That's also depends on the Trump administration, but that's probably not for this session. So I do see as this as kind of a conflict that Israel may get involved here, not because of ideological reasons, but mostly because of having some kind of a foothold in the region and having stronger alliances because the Red Sea now is one of the most unsolvable, most challenging problems that Israel is facing.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. Your point about it's really hard not to go with Ethiopia just because of the country's importance. If you're looking at it strictly from sort of a national interest perspective, really hard given the second most populous African country. At times has been one of the fastest growing economies in the entire world. The potential is immense. So that's hard for countries to go all in on Eritrea, for instance, if this really does happen. And again, like I think we all agree this would be disastrous for everybody involved. So even the countries, I think even Egypt, if they think this could be somehow great for them, I think they're probably mistaken. Because you can't possibly account for all of the ripple effects, the negative ripple effects that will come from such a war all over. We're already pretty much at time here. I'll just let each of you, if you want to hit one last point that maybe you didn't get to previously, and so we'll keep with our pattern here. So Rashid, give us one last point, and then we'll go to Alan and Asher.
Thank you very much. It was enjoyable, Joshua, to listen to the colleagues and also to learn from all the colleagues as well. I agree with what Asher said, that basically the Red Sea is now much more combustible than it ever was. We also live at a time when the US is also, to some extent, retrenching from the region as well. Of course, the Red Sea is one theater where we have seen the US actually not retrenching, but actually becoming much more assertive. We have seen airstrikes on the Houthis in the last few days. Yemen is a powder keg. An overthrow of the Houthis could probably make life easier for the shipping in terms of maritime perspective. But another haven probably would be opened. Iran has been dealt a massive strategic blow by Israel. It will take a long time, I think, to become a much more assertive player in the region. It can, of course, send weapons, long-range, arsenals to some of the groups, especially the groups like ISIS, which are now waging war in Puntland as well. But clearly, this is a theater which cannot be ignored, and the potential for conflict is seriously high. And so my call is probably to the US to say you need to stay engaged and you need to be following carefully what happens in the Red Sea.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment, Rashid. Yeah, and we didn't even really talk about Iran, but they have an interesting history in the Horn. The Emiratis and Saudis were pretty successful at boxing them out for a while, but we've also seen recently the Iranian, Sudan, reestablish diplomatic ties with the Iranians and etc. So, but again, we have a limited amount of time, so we'll have to leave that one. Alan, your final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think my first point is just
we shouldn't be fatalistic about any of this. I just want to echo the points that these conflicts may or may not be preventable, but at least we should try. And I do think old school diplomacy matters, and a little bit of diplomatic and political capital in this region can go a really long way. You can invest tons of political and diplomatic capital into other conflicts around the world, and it might barely, if at all, move the needle at the end of the day. Here, a little bit of investment goes a really long way and will save, frankly, a lot of not just lives, but just, ripple effects on the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, the Sahel, the Mediterranean, that can go on for decades. And it's underinvested in diplomatically, and because of that, a little investment goes not very far. But I just want to say I'm very worried about this region at the moment. There's a phrase that, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. In the Horn of Africa, I feel like when the world slightly quakes or shifts, the horn collapses. Like that's just like historically, it is where state formation is extremely unsettled. It's not at the it's a place that is strategically not important enough to have had great powers sort of come in and create hegemonic, security architectures. But they're all sort of involved somewhat. Meanwhile, you have all these middle powers who are within the region. You look at where BRICS is expanding, and it's basically the Red Sea as well. So you have a collection of great powers and middle powers, which was this, which this conversation was about, which is frankly a hot mess. Is the technical, is I believe the technical term. And there is no hedge. There is no. Like I said, none of the great powers have created a hegemonic security architecture, and the middle powers are very much jockeying. They're experimental in many ways. They themselves, their strategies are shifting, and then that is all happening in a political order which is where the sand just sort of shifts underneath. You've had two states secede over the past decades, another one break off in Somaliland. I'm very worried that as we see this geopolitical, as we see the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing now, that if we start to see even more conflicts than what we've already seen break out, and I think the conflicts that have broken out have been indicative of the fact that, of course, these shifts have already been happening and this free-for-all has already been happening. But I think it could really accelerate. And there are major stakes involved for these middle powers. It isn't all just, sometimes it's almost spoken of as almost adventurism, but these are countries for whom this is their near abroad. They think they need to prepare for the world to come. And these are serious matters. So I'm very worried. I think a little bit of diplomatic capital from all involved can go a long way, and that's my plea. Thanks.
Yeah, no, another well taken point about how it doesn't in some instances some of that diplomatic muscle can really move things in ways that are not possible in other parts of the world. So excellent point there. Thank you for that. I'm glad we're doing this last roundup. There's been two really good interventions, and we're gonna have a third one here. Asher, go ahead.
Yes, I also have to agree that the risk for escalation is pretty high right now. We look at the kind of internal issues within the Horn that, within Ethiopia, within Somalia, between Somalia and Ethiopia, between Eritrea and Ethiopia, that's one thing. But then you also see that the Horn is surrounded by conflicts, very high intensity conflicts all over. You have the Houthis and the Americans, you have the civil war in Sudan, you have the war in Gaza that affects, and you have of course, the escalation now ceasefire, but may be back in the Great Lakes area in Eastern Congo, and so the Horn of Africa is really surrounded by a lot of high-profile conflicts that can spill over and can intertwine and kind of all mix together. It is surrounded by Middle Eastern countries that are in a way more ambitious, but also more desperate for involvement and alliances and power from Iran, right? That we haven't talked a lot about it, but from Iran that is maybe in a very weak point right now, but they may see a lot of opportunities to go back and come back somehow, and maybe through their own, through Sudan, maybe through Eritrea, right? from Iran, but to the Gulf states that are also, as we talked, are not one unit anymore. Israel that we talked about, Egypt that sees it as an arena. So of course, Turkey. So we see a lot of Middle Eastern countries that are very keen at this specific moment to get involved in the Horn of Africa and in Sudan, and all of this together, the conflicts that are raging, the Middle East countries that are strong, is still strong enough. All the countries that we mentioned in the Middle East are pretty strong to do things, right? And they want to do things at this critical moment. And as we know from African history and in general, when external powers are getting involved in conflicts, it's usually makes those conflicts worse, not better. Usually, we know it from the Cold War and other instances. So I unfortunately I cannot be too optimistic. It's something that we really need to follow very closely. I think the Americans have I know Americans are withdrawing, right, or scaling back from the Middle East and many other parts of the world. But it seems like that the Horn of Africa specifically may be an exception here, or it should be an exception here. First, the Houthis. Second, the Red Sea in general. Third, maybe Somaliland, right? Maybe a new ally for the Americans if the Americans go this way. The Red Sea actually in global terms, and the United States thinks in global terms, obviously, is part of the also the race or struggle or conflict with China, right? It is a very important route geopolitically, strategically, that can be seen as actually part of the campaign against or right China. So it shouldn't just be seen as kind of like an African isolated issue. It should not even seen as a kind of terrorist Middle Eastern issue. It should be seen as a global issue that is very volatile. Volatile and can explode, and the Americans should put more attention there, either through, as Ellen suggested, peace initiatives, or through more, on the contrary, more military presence, because this is really the region that should have a lot of global and American attention.
Yeah, thank you. You could have potentially added South Sudan as well to one of those areas that may be at war very shortly. That is just next to the Horn. But that's a different topic for another day. Yeah, and thank you for reiterating the importance of the Horn. Rashid kicked us off, and so I think that's with some of those observations, it's a good way to wrap it up, because this is a really critical part of the world for all the reasons we've been discussing. Shipping lanes. If you look at maps of submarine cables, Red Sea probably has the densest concentration of submarine cables in the world, which are critical to global, almost global communication and data sharing and commerce and everything else. So, it's hard to assess whether the U.S. is retreating or retrenching, or because I think it's all being maybe the word is assessing. The U.S. is assessing, maybe is the word to use, because I think it's an ongoing process. I really do. And I don't know exactly where it's going. I hope it leads to profound attention and concern with this region, because I think that's what's required. But again, we went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but there's so much to discuss, and I really appreciated all of your thoughts. Thank you again for joining us, Asher from the Israel-Africa Institute, and University of Houston, Alan from the International Crisis Group, and Rashid from Sahan Research. Excellent panel. Really appreciated your expertise. And we will see you another time, hopefully.